This week on Viral History, we sit down with author and columnist Ben Macintyre to discuss his fascination with wartime and espionage, filmed at the fantastic Chalke Valley History Festival.
I'm interested in people who are not dead straight. I mean, I like people who are a bit off the centre. I mean, that can be quite extreme in some cases, like Eddie Chapman, who was Agent Zigzag, who was a professional criminal. But I've never been very interested in the straight bats, the people who do the kind of obvious bits of particularly of that wartime history, because actually we have a kind of idea about the war, that it was a very sort of straightforward moral issue, that you were either on the right side or the wrong side, you know. But actually war isn't really like that. And the more I write about it, the more I think it's actually painted in shades of grey. And it does attract, I mean, war does produce some very odd people. Or rather, perhaps the better way to put it is that some very strange people rise to prominence during war because it's such an extraordinary situation for most people. And I've always been interested in what sort of ordinary people do in extraordinary situations. So most of my favourite characters are kind of oddballs and eccentrics and people that don't fit into the kind of normal patterns of life. And of course espionage is ideal for that, because espionage attracts a particular kind of slightly wacky, I mean actually Churchill used to refer to them as people with corkscrew minds. And that's undoubtedly true. These aren't sort of simple one-dimensional people. And that's particularly true of the SAS, the wartime SAS, my latest book, because those are really very eccentric, most of them. They're people who wouldn't have found a niche in peacetime, and many of them didn't really. I mean, after the war was over, they couldn't adapt to peace. But war offered them an opportunity to be something very remarkable. I mean, I think one of the things about war is that although it's absolute hell, it does provide opportunities for people. It's a very intense period for lots of people. I mean, particularly the Second World War, where, you know, for a lot of these characters, nothing afterwards would ever measure up in terms of the sort of extraordinary colour of the lives they'd lived during the war. And there's a sort of intensity to it that is very interesting, I think. Well, the Ian Fleming project was one that sort of came actually out of left field for me, really, because I wrote a book about really where Ian Fleming ends and where James Bond begins, because I've always been interested in James Bond, who isn't. But, you know, I wanted to try and find out how much reality there was in the James Bond story and how much of it was Fleming himself and so on. Because Fleming always used to imply that, you know, quite a lot of Bond was himself. It wasn't quite true. I mean, he was a bit of a fabulist, if you like. He was a sort of self-mythologizer. But actually that came about because there was an exhibition at the Imperial War Museum of kind of Fleming and Bond. And they were really helpful with getting hold of artefacts and documents and so on. So it was really a sort of tie-in one. I would love to try my hand at fiction at some point. You know, I mean, the wonderful thing about non-fiction is you've got a beginning, a middle and an end. There's a structure to it that is, you know, you can't really move away from. And although, you know, I would love it when people occasionally say, you know, the books that I write are kind of stranger than fiction, or they read like novels, because that's lovely. I love that if I can get that right. But then I would love to try some fiction at some point. My problem is I'm not sure I'd know where to stop. You know, I'm particularly interested at the moment in kind of Russian espionage. I think that is going to be a huge subject. I mean, the Russians are really good at this stuff. They always have been, you know, right from the revolution, the Chalke, the KGB. They know how to do this stuff really well. And I think we really underestimate them at our peril. So I think people will be very interested to know who, in generations to come, who was fighting the secret war now. Because believe me, there is one going on. It's mostly digital, but it's not entirely cyber. I mean, quite a lot of it involves human intelligence still. You know, if we're tackling things like ISIS and so on, that involves getting old-fashioned, what sound like old-fashioned agents into the enemy camp, and you try and do that the same way as before. So in my area, I suspect we will be very interested to know who is actually fighting this battle. Well, in my area, I've been very fortunate actually, because starting under the Blair government, there was a progressive decision to start releasing intelligence archives. 20 years ago, it was illegal to report the colour of the carpets in MI6. You know, there was a real clampdown. But they started releasing them, and now MI5 routinely releases its archives. So to anyone who's interested in this area, there is a huge amount of material. Every 6 months or so, MI5 releases more of it. And the press, including myself, we write about it then and we describe the best bits in it. But there's an awful lot of other material inside there. I mean, it takes a bit of digging. You have to be prepared to sit in an archive in the National Archives and work your way through the material, but there's some amazing stuff in there. Adam Worth was this extraordinary character who was the model for Professor Moriarty in the Sherlock Holmes stories. And he was, again, a sort of character, a really wacko figure, really. He was a professional criminal. He ran an enormous international network. I don't know why it is that I'm so interested in professional criminals, but he was a remarkable man. And he, yeah, I mean, there has been some film interest in that. And in fact, now looks the most likely thing is that that's going to be an Amazon series. It's going to be a drama series that's going to run over several, perhaps even a dozen episodes or so, which would be great because it's a great kind of counterintuitive Victorian cops and robbers story. Really.